Hello everyone, Omar here. Today we're checking out this interesting little gadget. The box says it's a PCIe to PS2 expansion card, and technically it is, but whether it actually works depends on the operating system we are using. Why? Well, behind the scenes, it's actually a PCIe Express to USB controller with a built-in PS2 to USB converter. So if our USB controller isn't recognized by the OS right from the start, nothing, it's going to work. The good news is that this card also adds a USB 1.1 and USB 2 support, and it's basically a perfect match for any legacy operating system running on a PCI Express only motherboard. If you are wondering how it works, well, it includes a standard USB header, which can be connected to a bracket or to the front panel USB 2 ports. Now, there are some variants of this card that don't include a USB header, and honestly, those don't make much sense for retro builds. However, they can be useful in security-focused setups where all USB ports are intentionally disabled, leaving a PS2 as the only input option. What makes this USB 2 controller particularly interesting is that it's a true PCI Express design. The other two PCIe to USB 2 adapters I've shown here before are using classic VIA and NEC PCIe chips and a PCIe to PCIe bridge chip. And since we're talking about the newer design, turns out that the MCS 9990 chip that's inside this adapter actually works as for independent USB 2 controllers, all sharing the 2.5 gigabit bandwidth of the PCIe X1 slot. So on a 4-port card, each port gets its own dedicated EHCI controller, and I was actually wondering why this much newer USB 2 chip has a heatsink. I guess this design explains it. Turns out it can get pretty hot because, at least in theory, each port can handle 480 megabits transfer speeds on its own and in the same time. Now let's check out how compatible this adapter really is. Well, these adapters are often marketed as Windows 8 and up, but in reality they work with any operating system that supports USB, all the way back to Windows 95B with the USB supplements. Now, I haven't tested this card on Windows 95, but I did try it on Windows NT4, which was released soon after in 1996. Well, NT4 doesn't have a native USB support, but with a third-party USB stack, it can initialize USB 1.1 and USB 2 controllers, and it can handle basic devices like HID peripherals such as USB mice and keyboards, as well as USB storage. And guess what? It works, no reboot needed. However, aside from input devices and USB storage, we can't use most of other USB peripherals. In fact, some people aren't exactly sure that USB devices can work at all in Windows NT. Well, that's not the case with Windows 98 and Millennium Edition, which are much more USB friendly. They come with built-in USB 1.1 drivers that work out of the box, including with this MCS 9990 chip. For USB 2 support, we need to install third-party drivers like the ones from Orangeware, or we can go with the unofficial NUSB 3.6, which provides faster transfer speeds and includes USB mass storage drivers for Windows 98. This time, having USB support is much more useful since many USB devices are compatible with Windows 98 and Millennium. We're talking about floppy drives, optical drives, Wi-Fi adapters, and even USB audio interfaces, some of which are supported directly by the built-in drivers. For example, I tested a USB to SPDIF adapter, which by the way is still available online, and it worked flawlessly with the included USB audio drivers from Windows 98 2nd edition. So, can we call this a viable USB solution for running something like Windows 98? Absolutely. But if you are looking for the ultimate USB card, I'd recommend one with a VIA chipset, since it has official Windows 9X USB 2 drivers and it should be more stable in the long run. Now, what if you are not into retro builds like Windows 98? Maybe you're more of a Windows Vista or a 7 fan. Well, I actually got this expansion card for just 20 bucks from a guy who said he used it only once to install Windows 7 on a modern PC. Why? Because Windows 7, like every version released before, doesn't natively support USB 3 controllers. And of course, he picked a motherboard without PS2 ports. When it comes to, let's say, real PS2 ports, they connect directly to the motherboard's chipset via the so-called Super I/O chip, meaning they work in every scenario, no matter the hardware or Windows version. Well, except for Windows 1.0, since that came out before the PS2 standard was introduced in 1987, and it can't handle a PS2 mouse, but that can be fixed by using Windows 2 drivers which are PS2 aware. By the way, you just saw Windows 1.01 and Windows 2.1 running natively on a 13th Gen Intel configuration. This universal compatibility explains why modern BIOS systems emulate PS2 ports for keyboards and mice until the operating system initializes the USB bus. While USB-aware operating systems detect these devices natively during setup, DOS-based systems rely on the BIOS, which scans all USB ports, including those on expansion cards like this one, and presents connected keyboards or mice as being PS2 devices. This emulation usually works flawlessly in DOS and Windows 3X, and most of the time in Windows 9X. For older NT-based systems like Windows 2K or XP, the emulation works during the DOS portion of the installation. The good news, by the time the second phase of setup begins, Windows has loaded the USB drivers and we can continue without even noticing the switch. Now, what if the USB to PS2 emulation fails and our OS doesn't support USB at all, like Windows NT 3.1 or NT 3.51? In that case, we are out of luck. It's time to switch to a system with real PS2 ports. And there is the special case of Windows 98, which natively supports USB 1.1 controllers and input devices, but it won't detect them until the second phase of the installation. On top of that, on every Socket 1700 motherboard I've tested, there is a glitch. PS2 emulation works fine in DOS, but suddenly stops once Windows setup begins. If the native USB ports on the motherboard won't work, an expansion card like this one won't save us either. So here's the workaround. We start the first part of the installation in a virtual machine, then switch to the target system for the second part. That should do the trick. In the end, it turns out that these rather cheap PS2 and USB PCIe adapters are a good pick for retro builds, but if you are buying one just for the PS2 to USB conversion, you might as well grab an even cheaper USB to PS2 dongle. They usually use the same chip anyway. Well, I guess that's all for today. Stay tuned for the next video. OMORES out.